I think the most remarkable thing that Premier Ford just said was that he was not only willing to endorse the idea of the federal government putting on counter tariffs and that he was actively working with Minister Freeland to identify where those tariffs would come in Ontario and federally, but he actually, as he said, cut off energy. I mean, that's different, right? Not just point at point, but we would actually turn off the taps. And how America would react to that, particularly some of the U.S. northern states that we're quite friendly with and rely on our energy, is pretty dramatic case. But also the Premier went further, mentioning that obviously that the issue about Trudeau last night, mentioning how he felt that Americans failed in not voting in Kamala Harris, was brought up by multiple premiers. So obviously Prime Minister Trudeau was chastised in that meeting. So I'm going to have to trust that Marika's going to get the source in there and figure out what happened, because we're going to need to hear those details on how the Prime Minister and his ministers reacted to that, because it seems what was supposed to be just a gala night out has really turned into putting his foot into his mouth.
Jamie, on the message the Premier was delivering there, tariffs are coming. Like, it's not if, it's when. That's the first time we've heard a politician at any level be that specific. What do you take from that?
Yeah, there was kind of a lot in what Premier Ford had to say there. I think on the one hand, he almost sounded calm and reassuring, which I think is something that's actually been lacking when you've heard leaders generally talk about this in recent weeks. But there's a lot to mine there for news. The fact that he's criticizing the Prime Minister's comments last night that we were just talking about before he spoke was one. The fact that the Ontario is looking to have a counter tariffs applied to the U.S. What's that going to be? Energy being on the table, of course, although it's been something that's talked about inside the pubs of Ottawa and those in public policy circles. It's quite another to have the head of Canada's largest province musing now about that publicly. And I think when you look at kind of where it's going, I think it's really going to galvanize a lot of the conversation. A lot of people are going to have to react to what Premier Ford is saying and kind of steer the conversation that way. And so in the context as well, bring politics back close to home, everything's local. He's gearing up for a provincial election next year, and he's clearly draping himself and showing himself and acting and walking as the leader for Canada right now.
We're going to hear in a few moments from Minister Freeland and Minister LeBlanc. It'll be interesting to see, Laura, if their characterization of the way these tariffs are happening, like, when, not if, is the same as Premier Ford's, because, again, that's a big difference from what we've even been hearing a few hours ago.
It's a huge difference from, even our conversation 10 minutes ago. I think that it is going to be really interesting to see the tone that Minister LeBlanc and Minister Freeland come out and say. Generally they've been a little bit more keep calm and carry on. But Premier Ford was very explicit there. I think the notion that we might turn off energy to the northern U.S. is a massive change. The very clear plans that Ontario has for how to, protect the border that they share with the U.S. and that clearly the rest of the premiers are starting to think about, those are quite concrete plans and ideas that they are starting to look into. This meeting was not just an update meeting. It clearly was very substantive.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. They obviously got a message that was like, this ain't going well, Marika. And I felt like even the tone with which the Premier, he looked kind of despondent.
Yes. Yeah, he was downcast for sure. He really projected the seriousness, not just in his demeanor, but also with the words. And I'm very curious now to see how that compares or does not compare with Chrystia Freeland and Dominic LeBlanc, because as Laura said, that has not been the message from the federal government. And it raises questions about why Canadians are getting this message from Ontario's premier and not from their federal government. Certainly a lot more questions for Chrystia Freeland now coming out of that meeting. We'll see how she handles them, how frank she decides to be with Canadians. But the gravity for the economy, we can't forget, this isn't just a game of trolling and poking the bear. The economic consequences of these tariffs are something that Doug Ford has lived through already one time when he was in his first mandate, when Trump did it the first time on steel and aluminum. And so he also knows, right, what it is and what the ramifications are. And he clearly, I think he just notched things up way more levels than we have seen yet in Ottawa.
And even he was kind of discerning as we stand by and wait for Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland to address reporters. Even he, Kathleen, was discerning between the first go-round with Donald Trump and his comments tonight and now. Like he said at first, almost like, not to use the word aggressive, but like he's so matter of fact, like again conveying the certainty with which he thinks he's obviously being told these tariffs are coming.
Yeah, and he said Jan 20 or Jan 21 at the latest, but they're coming for us and we need to be prepared. And as the president of the Council of Federation, as he is the lead right now, the premier is, kind of set the stage in a way kind of showing up the federal government by saying, we're going to have another meeting. It's going to have to be early in January. We're going to have to see the plan. Like Ford really seems to be driving this as opposed to the feds. And obviously that was a discussion, of who was going to go first and why Ford went first. But Ford seems to be leading the agenda, not just on the things we've seen in the last the last couple of weeks in terms of the ad campaign, the messaging he's been putting out, the aggressiveness that he's been going into the media in the U.S., but it's also because Ontario really has such a close manufacturing relationship with the U.S. It's so important and critical to that province's economy.
Jamie, what do these comments tonight do to the discussion about, how Team Canada approaches this, how whatever, approaches the threat from Donald Trump? Because it seems to me like it's just evolved into a discussion about what counter tariffs to prepare, whether you cut off energy, et cetera.